Tihei mori ora, ina mana, ina reo rao rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this very special episode of the At Your Fingertips series, online sports discussions with top coaches, athletes and academics, where our panelists share their experiences and knowledge about this fast-paced and changing industry. Now, my name's Jamie Fitzgerald. I'm a proud alumni of the University of Waikato, and it's a real privilege to be here this evening. The title of today's discussion, Gender, Sport and the Female Athlete. Now, I suspect even in its title, we all can appreciate its scope, complexity, and perhaps even a bit of controversy. So I'm thrilled to be here to learn from our panelists, and for a few reasons. Now, I've got two daughters starting out on their own sporting journeys. I'm on the management board of an all-girls secondary school in Wellington. And again, I think maybe even this links to our chat today on language systems and structure. I'm a volunteer coach and committee member of multiple sports teams. And above all, though, I love sport. And I'm inspired by people just wanting to be their best selves on and off the field. So as a parent, supporter and influencer of how sport is organised and experienced by people, I want to know what I should be thinking or doing to help people achieve their goals in sport and recreation, whatever those goals might be. So we're going to make the discussion tonight really stimulating. I can't wait to learn from our panellists, but also practical. And I suspect all of us here feel the same way. Now, there's no introduction required for our panellists due to partly, I guess, the time we have together, but also their bios are available on the website. So I'm really keen that we get straight into it. And so, Amy, I'd love it if we could kick off with you, if that's okay. So tell us, what do you see as the biggest challenges in relation to gender and sport facing participants in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Thanks, Jamie. Obviously, there are a number of challenges, but when I was reflecting on this question, I was thinking about, what's most salient to me. And apart from things like inequitable access to resources or access to opportunities, I think one of the things we need to remember is that when we talk about gender, we aren't just talking about gender. So, women and girls aren't just women and girls. There are other axes of identity that intersect, which mean that sexuality, ethnicity, race, ability, age, culture, religion, all of those things layer into someone's experience. And the more of those aspects of identity that you have that position you, I guess, in a minority group, the more complex the barriers are to your experiences, and sometimes the more difficult it is to access opportunities that meet your needs. So I think it's really important to understand that we can't just isolate gender as one barrier or one thing that makes it difficult to access and participate. We need to think bigger. And the other thing that I really wanted to highlight was that we need to take a multi-pronged approach to addressing barriers for women and girls in sport and physical activity. So we need to work from the bottom up and the top down. And when I think about the bottom up, I think about working at the level of the community, working with co-design, influencing actual delivery and what that looks like for female participants, but at the same time working at the top down. So challenging and changing the socio-cultural context of participation. So what are the images and the messages or narratives that women and girls are seeing, and how do we change those so that the messages about who should participate, what they should do, are actually reflective of what women and girls want to do and make them feel like they belong, or that they're capable of doing things that maybe society tells them that they're not.
Gee, I think if we were to unpick all of that, we'd, 36 hours later, we may not have even covered everything. This is going to be exciting. There's a lot of us here. You talk about inequity and you talk about labels. Mariah, how about we come to you? So gender, sport, the female athlete, there's a lot of effort being put into this space. But what are you seeing in terms of what's going on to the gender identity and eligibility to participate then?
I guess I can really just speak to what's happening, in athletics. So if we start from the very top with World Athletics, we've got two policies around gender and eligibility regulations. So the first is around eligibility regulations for transgender athletes. I guess just the overarching rules, processes and all of that. We've actually got a second policy now that was just developed actually in 2019, and it's the eligibility conditions for female transgender athletes, specifically in relation to athletes with differences of sex development, so the intersex athletes. So as Amy was saying before around, there's so many ways people may identify themselves, and this policy was brought in after the Rio Olympics, actually, when we were kind of seeing a different differences in some female athletes. So this policy kind of addresses that, but it's actually only, interestingly, applies to athletes that compete in the events, track races between 400 metres and the mile. So there's a certain criteria that these female athletes must meet, in order to be eligible to compete. I know it's a massive topic that we could,
So that's interesting. So you've talked about the structure of which events it's applied to. We've also talked about structure. I'm just curious. So, I come from a rowing background, and the events, the sports, the races, it's, you're either in a male competing event, you're either in a female event. And yet there are other sports like my grandparents who play bowls, and it's all the same team. It's just you go out and you just do your thing, right? Now, across the panel, we've got loads of research that's been completed. Holly, what are you seeing in this space? What can we learn, in terms of the structures? Is it being forced upon us, or can we do something about it?
I think in a way it's coming, like Amy said, from the top down and the bottom up. We've just seen the IOC, their new guidelines around transgender participation in sport at the Olympic level, but they're very, very clear that these, prioritising human rights here. Participation in sport is a human right that everyone should have access to. That message should trickle all the way down to grassroots. And I know Sport New Zealand's working on a big policy document around this as well, because really, what is sport for? And when we start getting into the nitty-gritty of it, we've got athletes who are training to be the very best, but also if we're saying there's no room for you here, that's a pretty horrific message to be sending to young people, and often young people who might be struggling with gender identification. And sport and almost, what we need to see here is a better reflecting society. With society, we're trying to move not from binary understandings of male, female, actually recognising the fluidity and multiplicities of gender. But sport, it has a long history of being created by men and for men, and it reinforces binaries. Men participate here, women participate over here, and actually sport reinforces those binaries. And so we are seeing a lot of tensions in that area, but we're seeing some good leadership too. And
Wow.
It's a topic that is very controversial, and we've always got to remember that our words have impact. And I think we need to always be working towards more inclusive and supportive spaces for all.
Well, you talked about various campaigns that are happening around to try and address this, and I'm going to maybe ask you a little bit more about this in a moment, with feedback from the other panelists around some of those campaigns. And there's one I read about called "It's My Move." You might be able to talk about that. But you talk about the labels, and I'm keen to hear from you about media. Now, a bit of a shout out to one of my former lecturers at the Waikato Management School. I remember this phrase from him, and he talked about the media, about it either being we debated whether it was a passive mirror or an active shaper of how we see things. And so I want to ask you, Holly, about this. So how has it affected how we see things, or through the media? Is it, Yeah, tell me about that. Are they reinforcing some of these labels, or is that just society?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of research on media coverage of women in sport, and historically we've seen the media, marginalising, trivialising, sexualising women in sport. Though, over the last decade, we've seen important changes there. We're seeing more coverage of women in sport. We've seen a big $10 million investment from New Zealand Sport, from the government. Big part of that was about changing those visibilities, changing those narratives that Amy talked about before. If you can't see it, you can't beat it, right? And so we've seen Sky, they've had a big new campaign that's been very much focused on more coverage of women in sport. And so we've seen a shift there. I think it was last year, women's sport in New Zealand accounted for about 15% of the coverage of all sport in New Zealand. We're seeing we're seeing audiences and fans building around women's sport, with whether it's the cricket, whether it's the rugby, whether it's the Olympics. So we're seeing changes there, but still nothing like 50-50. We're so far away from that. But it's also interesting to think about, not just kind of those TV kind of newspapers, but also thinking about the social media landscape, where we're seeing more and more sportswomen using social media to tell their own stories, to document their own kind of journeys, and building audiences around their sport, around their own careers. But that also comes with risks. We see a lot of abuse happening in that space, a lot of sexism. And our research with High Performance Sport New Zealand has shown that it actually, social media is really impacting our sportswomen's body image issues as well. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of those visibilities, but we are seeing a lot of investment in that area and a lot of good work happening. Like the locker room, for example, telling stories about women in sport in New Zealand, everyday women, girls and women as well. And we're seeing, sports organisations like Sport Waikato, for example, doing a really good job around that as well. So there is progress happening.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm going to ask you later on, perhaps, for some of that research that you've done, but also some practical things of how might the rest of us be able to change, or what might we be able to do to try and address that. So, how about, Amanda, what do you take from all of this so far? From a para athlete, or from the Olympic Paralympic Committee point of view. Tell me what you think about this chat so far. What stands out for you?
I was just thinking about that, from the work that I'm doing is about highly impaired athletes, and just basically how opportunities for highly impaired athletes are lessening as time goes on. So, at the last Olympics, there might have been 4 events that were available for an S2 swimmer, but in the next Olympics, there's only 1. And so like what Holly was speaking about, that whole idea around the visibility of disability. So the super crip bodies are the bodies that are celebrated. And again, there's way more emphasis on the males there's a gender division as well. And so, the work that I've been trying to focus on is, highly impaired athletes. Nobody knows what it takes to get us into the pool, into the court, onto the pitch. So it's just that kind of idea about doing research, educating. I presented for the IPC in Brussels around some of the research that I've done. And what was great is that World Swimming and IPC Swimming reached out to talk to me about what it takes to get highly impaired athletes, greater inclusion, how to lift the participation. And so that's the sort of high level work that I'm doing. But, just around everyday stuff, it's in New Zealand, you've got, 24% of the population identify as disabled, and you've got something like 11% of children are disabled. And then, so the big push with Sport New Zealand is about play and that idea of physical literacy, and then try to create pathways. And then part of that is the organisations that are delivering disability sport in New Zealand are the Halbergs and the Parafeds, but we're quite limited. We're dotted around the country. But what I'm sort of wanting people to realise, if they reach out to those organisations, if they've got an idea and they're somewhere isolated and they think, we want to provide some accessible opportunities of sport, how about just reach out to your nearest Parafed or your nearest Halberg and go, hey, what am I going to do to make tennis work for disabled participation? Or what am I going to do to make this work. And then we can be resources. We don't actually need to be in your location, but we are absolutely open and happy to share the knowledge. So that's going to raise participation at that lower level, which hopefully then feeds in to competitive sport, and starts to raise the profile, normalize our being in those spaces, because having kind of disabled bodies and able-bodied spaces, it challenges people. And there's all that unconscious bias. So, it's complex. And again, I can chat all night for you too.
Yeah, I mean, so let's get to some practical things then with that. You've talked about how events are set up or physical spaces. So talk to us as listening, and on the panel will be administrators of sport, event organisers, and so on. So what else should we be thinking of? What could we be doing to address some of these things you've just touched on? Give us a few practical things, or what's on your mind.
Well, Stark, I mean, straight up, if all sport, if anyone involved in sport had a massive chunk, sport and rec degrees include a disability component, that would be fantastic. If all the organisations mandated that all coaches and anyone engaging with the public has some disability awareness, and then maybe parafeds and Halbergs, we could come up with some resources that would just help to broaden that knowledge, to make people aware of those unconscious biases, have them sort of question themselves before they, and then they can start to think about, well, is this venue even going to work? If we've got a disabled component, we want to put a disabled element into this, or an element of access into this, can we hold it in this space? Will it work if someone in a wheelchair rocks up here? So there's just some really, I think that we could just start to educate. I think that would really start to bring change and raise awareness. But in terms of putting on an event, just again, reach out to those parafeds and those Halbergs and people with lived experience, because honestly, because we know how great it feels to be involved and to be included, we're absolutely generally very willing to share our knowledge and try and help, because if it gets other people to play, we just want to share the love, because it feels so good to be active.
So there's the challenge to us all listening, folks, around just having to reach out. We've got plenty of people there wanting to support, provide, and making it easier for us, but we need to reach out. You talk about inclusion. Felicity, let me just come to you. How do we create, from your point of view, some of these spaces where people, don't feel judged for their performance, from a on the sporting field point of view?
Yeah, I guess it's looking at things at all levels, and obviously in all different environments. It is going to be different from sort of your age group teams, your school teams, all the way up to high performance. Obviously, as you become more high performance or into that elite level of sport, it is a lot of your team selections and whatnot are purely judged on performance, which is obviously where it gets a bit tricky to manage. But I guess it's coming at it from a whole holistic approach, and actually looking at the whole human, and that they've got things going on outside of sport as well. So say, for example, if you are a professional athlete and you're not performing, you're not just thinking that, I'm going to lose my contract, I'm going to potentially not have an income in a few months if I don't start performing. They have got something to fall back on in the long run. And yeah, I guess the management of the athlete themselves, them knowing that they are supported in more ways than just the sport as well.
Yeah, let's kind of dig into this a little bit further. So if we remind ourselves around the topic, gender sport and the female athlete, I'd love to hear your point of view on this, Felicity. If we, in the previous episode of this series, there was Shane McLeod and Wayne Smith. They referenced this book, Belonging, and culture within sport. And so I'm just interested from your perspective, is there actually a fundamental difference in sporting culture in New Zealand between genders, male, female? Just from your point of view, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think the females enjoy making it a really fun aspect to it, especially, and generally supporting each other and being genuine about it. rather than they kind of say that obviously men can quite often have a bit of a fist fight in a sense, and then they get over it pretty quickly. But females generally sort of drag it on a little bit longer, or it goes between people back and forward, and doesn't get resolved overly quickly. So that's an element of obviously managing a female environment, as well as having those open and honest conversations, but making sure that they are genuine, and there is the support network from your coaches to management to the sports psychologist to manage athletes' mental health. It's similar. Obviously, everyone at the end of the day is human. So it's
What do you think about this, Mariah, from an athletics point of view? You know, the call it the brand of different genders, the brand of the male athletics athlete, the brand of the female athletics athlete. You know, is it different challenges? You know, we'd love to hear from you what you think, and then maybe Amy and Holly, what research are you learning? So maybe, you know, Mariah, you first.
Yeah, I'm really not sure around in terms of like the cultural differences between sports. To be honest, I think that my experience as an athlete, I think I've been really fortunate. Like, athletics is actually a really inclusive sport in terms of genders and para-athletics as well. You know, para-athletes compete all of our competitions as well. They're integrated into competitions. But in terms of, you know, opportunities, facilities, uniforms, funding, it's all pretty equal for men and women in athletics, which is amazing. If anything, if there's an inequality or a difference that I've noticed actually more recently, it's might just been prize money, when there's been more prize money on offer for men. So that's been raised. Yeah, that issue has been raised to meet organisers. But yeah, no, I'm really fortunate actually that my experience has been really positive in that space. Yeah.
So we know that it's possible for there to be great things happening. Amy, Holly, who wants to, you know, chime in here with what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this one. If I speak from I guess, what the participant wants perspective, we're seeing significant differences in, I guess, the needs and motivations between gender when it comes to participation in sport and physical activity. So we often see things like social connection and social interaction really high up on what women and girls want to experience out of their physical activity participation, whether that's through sport or active recreation. We're seeing things like, competition really high up on men's agendas for why they want to be involved, where that ranks quite a lot lower in terms of women. And I'm speaking at the participation level, obviously not the high performance one. But we are seeing significant gender differences in some of the aspects that different genders want to experience out of their participation. So social connection would be one of the biggest ones that we're seeing in terms of ranking really highly for women and girls. Also things like, you know, weight management and fitness. You know, we're told as women that we should watch our weight, and that's obviously been internalised by some women in terms of their motivations for being active. But we are seeing feeling and looking good as part of women and girls' motivations. And then that's not just about weight, it's about, you know, the physical effects of being active for women and girls in terms of how they feel about themselves and their development and their mood and things like that as well. Whereas we don't often see some of those things ranking as highly for men and boys. So when we think about culture and environment, it's really important that we understand what different genders want to experience out of their participation, and we actually deliver to that, because if we don't, we're going to lose, you know, women and girls specifically when we have actually done a lot of work often to engage them.
Yeah. Holly?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we start making comparisons between men and women, because particularly in the elite sport environment, we've got to be really careful of not sort of essentialising gender differences as if all men are the same and all women are the same, because we know there's so much diversity within a category of women. There's lots of different personality types, lots of different motivational styles, and lots of different things that work for them and things that don't work for them. And just as there are men, and when we look at the international research on coaching environments and what works for men and women in sport. You know, even the way we ask questions is often quite based on these gendered assumptions. And we've just finished some big research here in New Zealand with elite male and female coaches who have adopted really proactive approaches to working with their sportswomen around health issues. And even when they're being really, really proactive and supporting their athletes, and not just performance, but also, you know, a holistic view of health and well-being, even when this language are these really essentialist gendered ideas around what, you know, and they're still using this language of girls, you know, really paternalistic language. So we've got so much to unpack here. And I even think, Amy, about some of the, you know, the surveys that go around and women saying, you know, they're not quite as motivated by competition. But is that perhaps because the way sports competitions have been framed has always been through, you know, sport, the systems have been created by men for men, and maybe those versions of competition don't work for many girls and women. But it's not to say that women might actually thrive in an environment that has been created by and for them. And I think that's the issues we're seeing. You know, just yesterday, a major investigation by Rugby New Zealand into our Black Ferns culture there. And it exposed, you know, intersecting variables of racism and sexism and really problematic issues going on at the highest level. And this is one of 11 sports in our country that have had these investigations going on. And what we're seeing here is sporting systems not working for many of our elite sportswomen because these systems were created by men for men. And as we've seen women's sport become increasingly professionalised, where we had women once organising sport, running sport, often on volunteer hours, doing it for the love of it, now we've got men in those roles, and they bring with them particular ideas of what sport is and what it should be and how to run it. And what we're seeing is women's voices not being heard. Women don't feel safe to express their concerns and their vulnerabilities. Many of them are stepping away, walking away from high performance sport. Some of them are brave enough to speak out and share their stories. But we've really got a system here that's not supporting the health and well-being of our elite sportswomen. And I think part of that is because of the structures and organisation of sport. And we've got lots of initiatives trying to change that, trying to get more women into leadership roles. But still, we're sitting around board meetings and who's there? Predominantly men. And we might have a few women in seats there, but still it's men's versions and visions of sport that continue to control what we're seeing. And that's, you know, it's we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that there are events designed for women that are working, created to designed that from their perspective it is fulfilling what they're looking to achieve. I am keen to hear, though, you mentioned earlier the support that you are providing coaches, managers, listening, like we talked about and heard from Amanda around things that we can do. We have coaches, administrators, managers listening to the panel, and I mentioned earlier that I'm kind of one of those. Help us out. What are some things we could do when it comes to those structures? What can we do that incorporates greater diversity of perspectives to make our sport better?
I think, you know, there's lots of layers to that, but it can certainly start with the self and start unpacking some of our own sort of gendered assumptions around, you know, watching, participating, you know, watching, supporting women's sport. You know, do we watch as much in the home? Do you watch as much women's sport as you watch men's sport? If not, what is that message telling to your children about your values in sport? Or how do we talk about, what language do we use to talk about women and girls in sport? How do we comment on bodies? How do we comment on achievements? You know, our kids are picking all of this up, and this is going to transfer into the next generation. So really, we do need to unpack our own kind of our biases that have been deeply embodied, you know, in us from a young age through our sporting systems that have been, you know, quite masculine often, and male sort of perspectives. So we can start by really sitting with some of our own tensions. You know, if we come back to the issue of transgender in sport, that can be a very uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, and a lot of the way the media framed the Laurel Hubbard situation with the Olympics last year. It was very polarizing. So people had to take a perspective on it. They had to sit on one side of the argument. And I'd say, I recommend to sit in the tension, sit with those uncomfortable moments. Don't feel like you have to take an opinion on it. Just try to unpack what's going on for you there, and try and educate yourself, and always, trying to create space for and listening to the voices of the women around you whose experience is really valuable.
Yeah. Well, for Amanda, Felicity, Mariah, we've just heard Holly talk about, athletes and the pressure on them and their identity and outside of their sport or what they're involved in, all of those additional pressures. So from your point of view, how do females or those with, whatever your gender, the role of you as a role model does this bring on just additional pressure that, well, from a performance point of view on the field doesn't help, but off the field, from a well-being, just it erodes it. Of the three of you, what are you seeing? What can we do to assist there?
I guess, as Holly said, just watching as much sport as we can on the TV at home of women's sport. I was lucky enough weekend before last to go to the Women's World Cup final here in Christchurch. And to be honest, the crowd that was there just blew me away, how many people were out and about watching. And it was a phenomenal game of cricket. So just watching those spectacles, and if you've got young girls, taking them down to watch women's sport. I don't think I knew that the White Ferns even existed till I was about 11 years old. So yeah, getting that exposure out there for those younger players coming through. It's been awesome from my perspective to see how much women's sport has evolved over sort of my career the last 10, 15 years. Yeah. And it's only going to get better over the next however long. So
yeah, I agree.
Oh, Mariah.
Sorry. Yeah, with the visibility kind of piece as well. And I think, well, hopefully Holly will know more about this, that female athletes are getting more exposure, but not only as an athlete, but like female coaches as well need more attention. We noticed as a sport there are fewer female coaches, especially in the kind of performance or pre-high performance space. So as an NSO, we're trying to come up with initiatives to upskill and support our female coaches, to try and develop them, because if you can't see them, it's hard to be motivated by that. And we want some female leaders and role models out there for our young athletes to show that you can, like, there is a pathway, you can do this. Also even on committees as well, typically athletic club committees have been dominated by males. So encouraging parents to get involved on your club committees and volunteer in those president, secretary, treasurer roles actually does a lot of good for our young athletes and up and coming.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, Mariah, the examples of what's happening overseas in terms of policy with gender, albeit with just a couple of different events. Have you heard how, though, any athletes impacted by that, how have they coped? What's been their reaction, whether they've been included in events or not in events? What's happening for those athletes off the track?
Yeah, I can only speak of a couple international examples. So I think Caster Semenya was probably our most prolific athlete. So she was affected. So she moved up in distance to the 5,000 metres and unfortunately didn't qualify for South Africa. And we had another couple of athletes who actually stepped down in distance to the 200 metres. And one of those athletes won the silver medal for Namibia, which was an amazing achievement. So I think they're doing the best they can. I'm not sure of any New Zealand examples, But yeah, those are international rules. New Zealand Athletics New Zealand has a different policy, or that World Athletics applies to national and international competitions. But yeah, they're doing the best I think that they can be doing. Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Amanda? I mean, we all know Sophie Pascoe. What are the pressures, from a female perspective, from a para-athlete perspective, that just, would be incredibly daunting for a male athlete to try and even comprehend?
From Sophie's perspective, but she's been doing this. This is her life. She's been focused, and that is all she is. Like, that is her gift to New Zealand, really. But what some of the stuff that's been difficult, it's only 2 years ago that actually Paralympic athletes get paid the same as able-bodied athletes. So you're telling me, so we have more barriers and more difficulty accessing everything, and yet we don't get paid as much as a gold-winning Olympian as our able-bodied counterparts. And so stuff like that is the things that I find difficult around disability. And just sort of even bouncing back to what Holly was speaking about is, the fact that you don't have female coaches, or so many female coaches. And so in the disability world, most of our coaches are able-bodied coaches. And it's not to say that what they bring to the party isn't fabulous, but I imagine if you could actually support and grow disabled athletes who then come on to be coaches, what gift they would pass on to the young athletes that they're working with, that lived experience that you can't know from just watching. So, that's. Yeah,
what do you think, Amy? Female coaches, how welcoming it is for them. Is there any trends here? What can we do?
I think we're definitely seeing less female coaches, particularly in that high performance environment. We've been looking at that at Sport Waikato in terms of pre-high performance, and then obviously high performance as well. And then even in that community sports space, we're seeing fundamentally a lack of coaches because of the way that sport kind of progresses from facilitation at the young age with kids and just facilitating play to that hyper competitive model, which often kicks in at secondary school. And women will probably be the first people to say, I can't do that. I don't have the ability. I don't have the technical and tactical skills to coach a team. So how do we support them to feel confident in that space? And how do we also shift, particularly at the participation level, sport to not be only about performance and be about participation? And how do we facilitate opportunities, particularly for children, to just be able to play and move? And then by doing that, we're probably actually creating opportunities for people and potentially women to feel confident in that space and to step into it and not worry so much about having to be the best coach, but having to be the best role model or best facilitator of a positive experience for a young person. And I think that's fundamentally something that we need to remember. We need to be delivering to what people want out of physical activity, not what we think that they want. And if we do that, if we use the voices of the participant, regardless of gender, regardless of ability, just the people that we're working with, if we understand what they want to experience and we can deliver to that, we're going to have far more success in terms of growing participation at the physical participation level, like a player, but also coaching. People will feel confident to step into that space because they know that all they have to do is help people move in a way that makes them feel good, rather than getting trophies or winning titles. I think that's something that we really need to remember if we're going to grow participation in sport.
Yeah, are you touching on there some of what the campaign This Is Me is about? So I'm interested to learn more about this, as well as other things happening around the country, but let's start with you, Amy, on this. So the This Is Me campaign, tell us what it is. And briefly, some of the things it's done.
Yep. So This Is Me was something that Sport Waikato developed in 2017. So it was developed before any government focus on women and girls. It was pretty early in the piece where we recognised that women and girls face varied and complex participation barriers, and that they weren't having positive experiences in sport and physical activity. So we recognised the need to change, and we recognised a need to work at that top-down and bottom-up level. So we developed probably more of an initiative than a campaign around supporting, encouraging and celebrating women and girls participating in physical activity, however that needs to look for them. So it was about more than just sport. Research at that point was telling us that women and girls weren't particularly interested in the current sporting model that was operating, and they were shying away from it, probably more interested in active recreation because sport wasn't meeting their needs. So we recognised that we needed to help them engage in physical activity via active recreation if that's what they wanted to do, but to change the model of sport, because we recognised that they probably did want to participate in the broader sense of sport, just not how it looked currently. So we developed an initiative that works at the level of the community, into schools and also into the regional sports sector, to help providers of sport and physical activity understand what they needed to do to better encourage women and girls to participate and to retain their participation. So it's about looking at the needs and wants of women and girls. So things like, that prioritisation of social connection, competition still being important, but competition in the way that women and girls want to experience it, and tailoring offerings to meet their needs. So we've worked with Northern Districts Cricket to create a new brand of cricket, which is more like backyard cricket. No fast bowlers, no long days in the field. Just stripping cricket back to the essence of what it was. We saw women wanting to give it a go, but the current model of cricket was really intimidating for them, and they didn't feel like there was an entry point. A woman in her 30s didn't feel like she could take up cricket because of the product that it looked like at the time. So we worked with Northern Districts to say, hey, how could cricket look different? And we've had over 1,000 women and girls participate in the new brand of cricket that we've instigated with them, and that's been in our own region in the Waikato, but also in Northland and the Bay of Plenty as well. So that's one example. Another example has been tackling period poverty in the King Country, where young women were wanting to be physically active but didn't have the resource or knowledge to manage their bodies while they're menstruating. So we recognised that this was a significant barrier, and we partnered with a national organisation, AWA, to give them sustainable period resources so that they could participate still during that time of their life. So those are a couple of examples of the bottom-up approach. And then top-down, we recognise that we can't be encouraging women and girls in our own context to be active and telling them that it's great for them and it's okay if the messages that they're exposed to in the national context, whether that's social media or mainstream media, are telling them that sport and physical activity aren't for them or that they don't belong. So we've used social media to encourage women and girls to celebrate the ways that they get active, and kind of, fill that gap that we see between the high performance athlete, female athlete, which is, great that they're experiencing more coverage and we see them more regularly. But then we've also got on Instagram, for example, the fitness model that we see, which is giving people messages about what it means to be active and what your body should look like if and when you are active. What we don't often see is the real woman or girl being physically active. What, for example, I look like when I'm physically active. That's sometimes missing from the story. So we recognised that as a gap and saw a real need to actually start telling that story. The everyday woman being active looks and feels like this, and they have these struggles and they overcome them in these ways. And by doing that, we've seen, confidence grow from women and girls that they can actually do this, and it can meet their needs. And we've seen changes in delivery in our region to make sure that what's on offer is actually meeting the needs of females.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Amy. And what I love is also that you're able to help us celebrate where it's working well in some of those initiatives and with Northern Districts and so on. It can't be the only thing that's happening around the country, though. We know that there must be other initiatives, campaigns, pockets where good stuff is happening. Holly, you talked about some of these things earlier as well, and I understand that you've been supporting or involved in some as well. So It's My Move? Can you just briefly just give me a bit of an overview of that as well, Holly?
Yeah, It's My Move obviously I think it took a bit of inspiration from the the sport Waikato model, actually, but we've seen other initiatives like it around the world. But I do think it's been long overdue. The research has been saying this for decades, actually, that girls and women are, moving away from competitive organised sport, picking up, recreational physical activities, lots of push and pull factors, away from organised competitive sport for women and girls as well. But the It's My Move campaign is very much targeted at the teenage girl, because we know the drop-off rate is really significant there with body image issues. We've got, a whole lot going on in that time in a young woman's life, schooling, social group changes, different types of social pressures. And so, the whole campaign is really about, increasing the visibilities of young girls who move in a whole lot of different ways, whether it's, TikTok dance videos in their rooms with their mates, or if it's skateboarding in down the street, or walking the dog in the park. Actually celebrates all types of movement for the purposes of joy and pleasure and social connection. So it's quite an important campaign, and I really like what it's doing, actually.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Well, there's a message and lesson for us all listening as well, that there are two, we've just heard from two wonderful initiatives, campaigns that we should, after this panel, jump online and have a look at.
Jamie, I'd just say, what's great to see is the investment. That campaign has been had a significant investment in time and resourcing, and now those messages, which are research informed, are going out widely, and they're going. It has two directions. It's going to young girls themselves, and all the media and all the products are designed for meeting, young girls' needs, and then also at parents and those who are providers of sport. So it has two different audiences, which is really important. But it's the investment, it's the backing, it's the funding and supporting women's sport. And then we can say, yay, women's sport, getting more money, but actually how many decades of undervaluing and underinvestment have we had? We've got a long way to go of investing in women's sport before we can even look at catching up. Yeah.
Well, there was I think a business academic that once said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. But Amy, Amy and Holly, thank you very much. For those, and for all of us listening, definitely we need to jump online and gain some inspiration. And there are tools and other bits and pieces online that I've seen that we can take. We have covered a lot. What I'd love to do is to ensure that by the time this webinar is over, that everyone listening has had the opportunity to take away some practical tips or thoughts, insights that they can apply to whatever their involvement is in recreation sport. And I mentioned that I'm involved in the administration, the coaching and so on. I'm really keen to hear from all of you before we wrap up on, are there any simple things that we can do which haven't been covered so far today? So without putting you all on the spot, who should we jump to first? Amanda, you've got a nice big smile on your face.
Oh, I have not. So what are the takeaways from this? And I think I just have to reiterate, we're a difficult population to reach because we represent, like I said, 24% of the population, but we're splattered out all over the place, and getting disabled people to engage in sport is really difficult because most of the time the opportunities just aren't available, and people are just, no one reaches out and says, hey, look, we've got this tournament on, but there's an accessible component to it if you're interested, because everyone doesn't think that they should or could, or they don't know how. So I think the key thing for all around New Zealand, for all of you that are going to be putting on events and stuff, is just reach out, like I said, to the Halbergs and to the Parafeds. Look online, find out who the nearest disability provider is, even just ask questions around, how do you do sport, and someone will put you on to someone, and just start to ask questions about what can you do, some simple things that actually make this space work for more than just abled bodies. Because, you know, I mean, gender is one thing, but disability is a whole other kettle of fish, you know, and even within that disability space, you know, women are represented down the line. It's mostly men that play. So I think that's a really important message. I just want people to be brave and reach out, because they won't be turned away, and people are always willing to share their knowledge if it means greater inclusion.
Yeah. I know that the theme for our discussion today is gender and the female athlete. Yeah. But before we move on, I am just curious to hear from you. I understand that from a central government point of view, the ministry will be changing from a disability, like in terms of Ministry of Disability. Will there be a flow-on effect, do you think, into how it influences sport? Do you think, have you heard any rumours, any thoughts?
No, I haven't. It's all just so new, and there's still a lot of talk around even the fact that the person who's in charge of that is able-bodied, and you're just like, it's all just kind of too high level. But at the moment, the work that even like Sport Waikato and all the researchers are doing, and Sport New Zealand, like the fact that it's about play, it's about getting physical literacy and about getting kids to understand their bodies, and getting organisations to just open up the play aspect to kids with disabilities. It gives them confidence, so they're going to move on. They're going to be able to move through life and feel like in charge of their bodies, just like women, like the women that you've spoken about, Amy. It's that same thing with being disabled, is owning who you are and knowing that there are opportunities for you to use your body in really active and fun ways. So I think that that's the key part of this conversation. It's just changing perceptions of what bodies should look like in sport. And we all should be able to do this. It's a human right, you know, and it's so much fun. We can't miss out.
No, we don't want to miss out. Well, speaking of missing out, let's go from an athlete perspective. A couple of things that you wish that could happen, or a couple of practical things that the rest of us could think of. So, Felicity, let's go to you. You know, what are a couple of things that you wish could happen, or a piece of advice for the rest of us?
Oh yeah, I guess with my Athletics New Zealand hat on. If you're a deliverer, a sport deliverer, you know, you're an NSO, RSO, RST, provide opportunities for females to get involved and upskill, you know, provide female leadership or coach developer courses or officiating courses for females. And if you're a parent or a volunteer or just keen to get into coaching or something, make the most of those opportunities. Because they are really cool environments. You'll learn so much and have so much fun. I've been on a couple of courses where they're or networking events with other females in my field, and it's awesome. It's awesome to have that support around you. So make the most of those. And if you're a deliverer, be proactive and put them on, because they're wanted.
Thanks, Mariah. Felicity, what else?
Yeah, I guess from both a player and a coach perspective, I personally found it really rewarding going back and giving back to sort of those secondary school and primary age girl students, and actually being a bit of a role model for them and showing them that there is a pathway. And I would encourage a lot of athletes to go back and encourage that next generation coming through. And it's really cool to see that there is a lot of that going on out there at the moment, with your national athletes going into schools and inspiring the next bunch of girls. And from a coach perspective, just if those regional bodies can keep providing upskilling opportunities to females to get them involved as coaches, as managers, and simply as those role model people to the girls in your teams, and getting as many females involved as possible, really, but really supporting them on whatever path they're in.
Yeah, helping athletes be the best they can be, whatever their goals are. Yeah, and I really like that. Amy, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, look, I think this is really important. I think one of the things to remember is that involving women and girls in physical activity and sport and whatever the offering is one of the single best ways we can grow what we're doing. That's 50% of the population. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer that if you're wanting to grow your participation base or even your revenue in terms of your memberships, if you're actually offering something that's meeting the needs of the 50% of the population who probably it isn't currently, then you're doing pretty well. It's also important to remember that you need to deliver to or coach the person. You need to understand what they want and deliver to that and not make assumptions around thinking that you know what people want. So collecting the voice of your participant, understanding from them what it is they want to experience or that they need to experience to feel that they belong, to feel included, to feel valued is really important. And often that can change quite often. You know, you have to keep asking for that feedback. If we keep doing what we've always done, we're always going to get what we've always got, which is a pretty inequitable system. And it's literally the definition of insanity to keep going the way that we're going. So we do need to change, and we do need to not be afraid to do things differently. Just because things have always been done the way that they've been done doesn't mean they have to continue to be that way. So we need to remember that experience is made up of a range of different things. It's not only the spaces and places that people get involved, but it's the people, it's how you welcome people, how you make them feel. It's around the convenience and timings of things. It's around the requirements that you have of people to participate. If all of those things aren't working for the participant, and if we're thinking about women and girls, there are a whole range of different ways that some of those things might not work, then we're not going to get participation and we're not going to be offering something that meets needs. So it's a complex challenge, but there are a range of things that we should and could do to make sure that people can access the opportunities that they definitely want to do. Research says that there's appetite to participate. So what we have is not a demand problem, it's a supply problem.
Yeah, and you've already shared with us this evening examples where it is possible and that it can be done. Finally, Holly.
Yeah, I think, I'm a researcher and an educator, so I would encourage people, whether they're parents or providers or coaches or managers, there are amazing resources out there created for you to educate yourself. And I'm going to give you two examples that I've been lucky enough to be involved in over the last few years. One of those is a Sport New Zealand report that was led by Dr. Nita Ahmed. Amy Marfell was on it with myself and Justin Richards. It's titled Building Cultural Inclusion in Active Recreation and Sport, Insights from Muslim Women. So we hear from, in this report, lots of different Muslim women across the country about their experiences in recreational and high-level sport, and lots of learnings from providers as well. And I think there's some good tips in there in terms of reflections and things that we can do better in the sector, because we are an increasingly multicultural society, and the needs of Māori or Pacific or Asian or Muslim girls and women, they're intersecting with gender as well as culture and sometimes religion as well as class and ethnicity. All these things we need to, like Amy mentioned earlier, it's complicated. So there are resources out there. It's written for the general public. So, hopefully something like that is useful. Another resource, this is more at the elite level, is High Performance Sport New Zealand. I'm part of the Whisper group, which is Healthy Women in Sport, a Performance Advantage. And we've been working together. It's led by Dr. Bruce Hamilton, who's the medical lead for High Performance Sport. We also have a lot of other sports doctors and sports scientists and psychologists and nutritionists, and I'm the only sociologist on there. But on the Whisper website, which is on a High Performance Sport New Zealand website, there's a lot of educational resources that we've put a lot of time into creating short videos and documents that are very much for coaches and for parents and for athletes. And so those resources are all up there, whether it's around healthy nutrition or dealing with social media and body image, or how to build a healthy environment for your young sportswomen. There's resources out there, and we can all educate ourselves just by little things like reading and listening and watching.
It's fantastic that you were able to refer to the resources. Those of us listening may have been trying to scribble or remember a couple of those things. The high performance sport one, people will know where to go to. Building cultural inclusion that you mentioned. Can you just very quickly say where people can find that if they were wanting to track it down?
Yeah, that's on the Sport New Zealand website. So it's just in their resources section there titled Building Cultural Inclusion in Active Recreation and Sport. And the PDFs in there, and there are a bunch of different stories that came alongside that, working with the locker room, etc., about Muslim girls and women in sport. So there's lots of great resources available.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Folks out there, our time has unfortunately come to an end. We started our discussion admitting that the topic was incredibly broad, complex. We've had a crack at it, though. Some of the things, I've been scribbling notes down. We've sort of talked about the fundamental operating model of sport and recreation, covering things from structure to pathways, looking at delivering sport or recreation, absolutely to the person from their perspective. Amy's covered off so much. We've heard real examples from the perspective of students, from coaches. Felicity, Mariah, thank you very much. The additional thoughts from you, Amanda, thank you very much. And obviously the research that all of you have really been involved in. But Holly, you've discussed this. Promotion, the pathways of athletes, and also those of us who are involved in the administration. I think you've put a bit of pressure on us, but everyone listening, I suspect, already has a sense of urgency to want to do something. My name's Jamie. I have been absolutely sort of overwhelmed with your experience. Our wonderful panelists, Amanda, Felicity, Holly, Mariah, Amy, thank you very much for your contribution. For all of you out there, this will be recorded and available to you. The At Your Fingertips series, this isn't the only one, so make sure you track down some of the others. I've enjoyed watching some of the previous ones. What I might just do is finish with a very short karakia, but we wish you all the very best in your own pursuits. And again, thank you very much to our panelists. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manaki tia, mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ao kia aorangi. Thank you very much, folks, for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.